think one of the big ingredients is our youth, is our young people, and they are the future. I'm wondering what sort of ideas you might have about reconnecting them.
From the point of view of anybody, I think to involve them, they need to have a stake in the country. And I suppose what young people will feel, not just here, but I guess in Europe as a whole, given that the rate of unemployment for young people is about twice the average in each country, is that they don't have that stake. And as we've seen, huge numbers of them have left this country and gone abroad searching for work. If there's any consolation in it, perhaps is that many of them have gone with a reasonably good education. But clearly, our biggest problem is to provide jobs here at home. And I must say that while the kind of export-led recovery idea will create a certain amount of employment, the experience of the 1990 period, when we created from, say 94 to 2001, about 450,000 new jobs. The great bulk of those jobs were not created in export-related industries. They were created by domestic demand. So the big challenge is to try to improve domestic demand here. Now, in part, that's inhibited by debt, obviously, because we have private debt here, which is the equivalent of 300% of our GDP. So if people have a lot of debt, they won't spend. But we have to try to stimulate, essentially, the economy by doing the things which get people in work and by get people spending in the economy, which in turn has a multiplier effect on the number of jobs. And our view on that for quite some time has been that we do need to invest. And so other people have spoken, for instance, of the deficiencies of the broadband. We have the deficiencies in the water infrastructure. There are plenty of things that need to be done in the country, and we have to find the ways of investing in order to do that. Now, there's a lot of work has been done by the Nevin Institute for Economic Research about how precisely that could be done. But this is, and some, to be fair, I mean, the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund idea is a partial response to that, but in my view, not enough. But the whole objective anyway is to get to the point where we can create employment for people, and it's only then that they will begin to have a real stake in the country and become engaged in discussions about its future.
On the one hand, I see very capable young people, very good young people who really energise me when I meet them. And I see that, the research that was done last year in UCC shows us that a lot of the people who actually emigrate already have a job. So I see in those young people a great sense of adventure. I think it's actually very healthy to leave Ireland for a while, and I would be really hopeful that they would come back. On the other hand, I'm involved in an organisation which deals with young people's mental health, so I'm quite tuned into that area. And what I see also among young people is a huge sense of confusion, is a huge sense of fear about the future, is a sense of just not knowing really what they want. And I think that's really driven, and again, there would be research to support this. This is driven by the pace of change, by the nature of the recent changes in our society. And there's a gender difference in this too. It seems to affect boys more than girls. And it's manifested in some of the mental health problems we see. So I would be very concerned about the need to respond to that and the need to really position our services to respond effectively to it before it becomes more acute for the individual in question. And, we've had in the last couple of years really serious issues about mental health funding, and that's all related to this. Just on the point about democracy that sister over here raised, I would say two things about that. One is, I think that people have really lost faith a bit in democracy over the last few years, because I think that when they voted for this government, they really voted for change and they haven't seen the reform. I know that point is often made, but it is really unfortunate that there hasn't been the kind of reform that I think people expected. And that's reforms in our political institutions and in our institutions generally. And it's certainly very unfortunate that some of the banana skins that the current government have slipped up on have actually taken over the public discourse, while some of the important achievements have actually been taken for granted. So I think there's a real issue about that. But the other issue that dogs us as a democracy is the clientelism and the brokerage, because that really stymies everything in the end of the day. It was a huge problem in the Celtic Tiger days because it really was behind all of the corruption and so on that we've seen. But it also dogs us in trying to move forward, because what it does is it makes people retreat back into localism. And you see this in the way in which so many local candidates are elected now in by-elections and in general elections. And you see that as a kind of challenge to existing party political processes, and that's quite worrying.
Whether or not the bailout was an ideal thing, perhaps we can move on in terms of where do we go from here, having exited the bailout.
I was interested to see the regulator coming out with his suggestion that banks should require a 20% deposit for a new home. I think that, it got an unbelievable reaction. But what I liked about that was that we had a regulator who was actually taking a position. If we go back to 2008, 2007, they weren't. They were afraid to take a position. They took a position. They said, this isn't, we're not going back to where we were. And I'm starting at 20%, so talk me down. And I think that's a really big step in protecting us in future from something similar happening.
The bailout is not over. It was stated earlier in the discussion that we'll be paying our debts back, or the debts we've been saddled with, until 2051. So I think the point that the government might have consulted with the citizens, I think it would have been very important in terms of legitimating the decision. Obviously, the government at the time was under a great deal of pressure because of Trichet's letter and threats about liquidity, cutting off money in banks, so people couldn't use the ATM machines. I think if the citizens had been consulted, there might have been a much more inclusive dialogue. Presumably the politicians were afraid people would vote no and the crisis would get worse, but I think if they trusted the people, they might have had a much stronger negotiating hand. And also the very difficult choices that David Beck has particularly spoken about that are going to face us. If you don't have legitimacy, then it's very difficult to govern, because people say, well, you made a huge mistake. And it wasn't just the government at the time, the whole political class made that mistake. All the major parties, with the exception of the Labour Party, but then when they joined the government in a so-called democratic revolution, that was at the beginning of their manifesto, they bought into the bailout agenda. And I think that's created a real democratic crisis. How do we get out of it? I think we have to learn the lessons. And I think it's very important for the political elite to listen to what the citizens are thinking and saying, and to factor that into their decision-making process. And the only way we can do that is by deepening our democracy. So that means that we move beyond the model we had in the first 100 years. When De Valera was Taoiseach, all he had to do was to look into his own heart, to know what the Irish people were thinking. Well, now we don't need that kind of patriarchal figure, though some people have talked about a dictator. We have a highly educated population that are very sophisticated, do understand the realities of decisions. And I hope as we move forward into the second century of being a republic, that we will talk more explicitly than we have in the first 100 years about what we mean by that, how we want that republic to work, what are Republican values, where does the citizen sit in terms of Republican values. I think if we don't have that conversation, then we won't really understand what's happening to us. And there are three possible models of governance. Oligarchy, we don't simply have a democracy, we're told we have a democracy, but in fact there is oligarchy ruled by the rich, people with very, very large ownership, which we've heard about today, who tend to own the media, who tend to influence the truth, though the internet has made that, has broadened our sense of understanding of truth and reality, and that's been very helpful to democracy. So we have oligarchy, we have democracy, but we need to think of broadening that democracy so it embraces more participatory forms in a complementary relationship. And finally, of course, there's monarchy or dictatorship, but that's a pretty hideous thought. And most of us know that the good society is the democratic society, but you can't defend democracy by simply denying what the challenges are. You have to reason your way through the challenges if you're going to come out the other end. So politics and policy must be interconnected in a reasoned dialogue, and I think that's the future of democracy in the second millennium of our republic, which joyously, I hope, we'll celebrate in 2016.
You talked about trying to convince corporations that paying tax was good. It's a good idea. Do you know how you would go about convincing them?
We need to be able to describe very clearly how taxes are being spent. That's going to be a big help because it'll be through communication of that to these corporates, and also cooperation, which is happening much more actively across state lines, to pursue them and go and visit them and explain it to them, and get the message out that this is part of the reason that they're being successful. Nobody does that, and I think we have to get that whole message clear, and we have to be able to deliver on accountability as well as transparency. It's got to be, two steps: transparency first, accountability second. And I think you'll find a willing audience. I think because the problem is they don't believe that their taxes are being properly deployed, and they want to make those decisions themselves, which is most unhelpful.
As regards democracy, it's really important to consider where people get their information. It's really important to consider who controls the information and what interests control that information. And he's so right when he says there was just one discourse, and that is the case in relation to the bailout. But that is the case with so many issues. Just watch it. If you pay attention to it, you see it. And unfortunately, you see it reflected then next weekend in the opinion polls in the Sunday papers. Second point is just about the person who raised about investment in education and early childhood education and so on. I actually think that one of the few areas in which we've made substantial policy progress in the last 10 years is in the whole field of early childhood. Because we had a department, we had an office for the Minister of Children, we then had a department, we now have a new Child and Family Agency. We also have very good research and data on children. We have a good longitudinal study going on. We have a lot of money from Atlantic Philanthropies going into early years initiatives. So I actually think we're not doing so bad in that area.
On the issue of democracy, I think it's important that democracy evolves and grows. The alternatives, and we've seen evidence of them, and David's just spoken about them, are real threats to democracy. But the only way to defend democracy is to deepen it, to expand it. When we had the welfare state, the state resituated itself towards civil society. It was a good state. By 1980, that had broken down, and the state resituated itself towards the market, largely leaving civil society and the citizen outside. The market then failed in 2008, and we went into a crisis, not just an economic crisis, but also a democratic crisis. And that, I think, if you've listened today, relentlessly, speakers have talked about that crisis in Europe, that crisis in Ireland. Unless we address and involve the citizens in addressing that crisis and coming up with solutions, I think instability and ungovernability will deepen, and that is something that we really, really need to stop by being proactive, by having what the government proclaimed when it came into power in 2011, by having a democratic revolution. Involve the citizens in a structured and civilized and reasoned way. That, I think, will legitimate what the government does, and it will make our society more stable, and I hope that happens.
Thanks very much, and I would like to thank our 4 panellists this afternoon, this last session, for what I think was a very interesting conversation. Conor Killeen, Patricia O'Hara, Fred Powell and David Begg.